The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of 14th century Florence as merchants hurried to market, their wooden carts clattering against stone. Children laughed as they chased each other through narrow alleyways, their voices echoing off towering cathedral walls. Life pulsed through the Renaissance city like blood through veins, vibrant and unstoppable. But beneath this facade of prosperity, something sinister was already stirring. Something that would reshape not just Florence, but the entire known world. Something that historians would later try desperately to erase from our collective memory. Welcome to a journey through the hidden epidemics of the ancient world, where the truth has been buried beneath centuries of deliberate silence, political manipulation, and academic cover-ups. I'm your guide through these shadows of history, and what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you view the past, the present, and perhaps even your own mortality. Picture this scenario for a moment. You're walking through a museum, admiring ancient artifacts, reading plaques about glorious civilizations and their magnificent achievements. The Romans with their engineering marvels, the Greeks with their philosophical breakthroughs, the Egyptians with their architectural wonders. But what if I told you that every single one of these civilizations faced catastrophic health crises that make our modern pandemics look like minor inconveniences? What if the very foundations of human progress were built not on triumph, but on surviving waves of disease so devastating that entire populations vanished without a trace? The establishment doesn't want you to know this story. They've sanitized our textbooks, whitewashed our historical narratives, and created this comfortable myth that ancient peoples died from warfare, natural disasters, or simple old age. But the archaeological evidence screams a different truth. The burial sites, the mass graves, the sudden abandonment of thriving cities, the desperate medical texts carved into stone tablets, all point to something far more terrifying than any sword or siege. We're talking about epidemics so severe they rewrote the genetic code of entire populations. Plagues that killed not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but millions upon millions of people in ways so horrific that survivors couldn't even describe them properly. Diseases that spread faster than wildfire, mutated beyond recognition, and left behind evidence so disturbing that powerful institutions have spent centuries trying to bury it. Why would they do this? Why would historians, governments, and academic institutions conspire to hide these ancient health disasters? The answer is simple yet chilling. Because understanding these forgotten epidemics reveals uncomfortable truths about human vulnerability, about the cyclical nature of catastrophic disease, and about patterns that suggest we might be living through the early stages of something remarkably similar right now. Every civilization believes it's immune to the disasters that destroyed those who came before. The Romans thought their engineering and organization made them invincible. The Byzantines believed their walls and wealth could protect them from anything. The Aztecs trusted in their gods and their military might. They were all wrong, and the evidence of their wrongness has been systematically removed from mainstream historical education. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The techniques these ancient peoples developed to combat their epidemics, the medical knowledge they accumulated through desperate trial and error, the social structures they created to survive waves of mass death, all of this invaluable information has been deliberately suppressed. We could be learning from their experiences, preparing for similar challenges, understanding the true patterns of disease and human response. Instead, we're stumbling blindly forward, repeating the same mistakes that cost our ancestors everything. Consider the Antonine Plague that struck the Roman Empire in 165 CE. Official histories mention it briefly, describing it as an unfortunate but manageable setback. They'll tell you it killed maybe 5 million people over 15 years. But when you dig deeper into the archaeological record, when you examine the mass burial sites, when you analyse the population genetics of European peoples, a far more terrifying picture emerges. This wasn't just another disease outbreak. This was a civilization-ending catastrophe that fundamentally altered the genetic composition of the Mediterranean world. The Romans, in their meticulous record-keeping, documented symptoms that don't match any known historical disease. Victims developed black pustules that appeared overnight, fever so intense it boiled their blood, and a wasting condition that consumed flesh from the inside out. Entire legions vanished not in battle, but in hospital tents where soldiers died screaming in languages no one recognized, as if the disease had somehow scrambled their very ability to communicate. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote in his private journals about walking through Rome and finding entire neighborhoods empty, doors standing open, meals still sitting on tables, as if thousands of people had simply evaporated into thin air. These journals, by the way, were classified by the Vatican for over 1,000 years, and only recently made available to select scholars who signed extensive non-disclosure agreements. But the Antonine Plague was just the beginning. What historians call the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century was exponentially worse. St. Cyprian himself, the Bishop of Carthage, described symptoms so bizarre and terrifying that his letters read like horror fiction. He wrote of people whose skin turned translucent, revealing their internal organs pulsing beneath. He described victims who aged decades in a matter of days, children who grew full beards overnight before collapsing into dust. The archaeological evidence supports these seemingly impossible accounts. Excavations in North Africa have uncovered burial sites where bodies show signs of rapid cellular breakdown, where bone structure appears to have been altered at the molecular level. Carbon dating reveals that thousands of people died simultaneously across vast geographical regions, their bodies showing identical patterns of tissue degradation that modern pathologists can't explain. Yet none of this appears in your standard history textbook. Why? Because acknowledging these realities would force us to confront uncomfortable questions about human fragility, about the potential for similar catastrophes in our interconnected modern world, and about the possibility that our ancestors possessed medical knowledge we've somehow lost. The conspiracy goes deeper than simple academic oversight. In 1347, when the Black Death began its march across Europe, the initial reports described symptoms that evolved and changed in real time. Early victims in Crimea showed classic bubonic plague symptoms, but by the time the disease reached Constantinople, witnesses reported entirely different manifestations. People died with their eyes turned completely black, their skin hardened into shell-like plates, their hair falling out in perfect geometric patterns. The Genoese merchants who first brought the plague to Western Europe kept detailed trading logs that were immediately confiscated by church authorities and remain classified to this day. What we know comes from fragments, from coded messages hidden in seemingly innocent business correspondence, from deathbed confessions of priests who broke their vows of silence. Brother Thomas of Monmouth, a Benedictine monk who ministered to plague victims in England, left behind a hidden manuscript describing what he called the changing sickness. He wrote that the disease seemed to learn and adapt, that symptoms shifted based on the victim's social class, occupation, even their religious beliefs. Noble families died of wasting fevers, while peasants developed the characteristic buboes. Merchants suffered from bleeding that wouldn't stop, while clergy experienced seizures that left them speaking in ancient languages they'd never learned. This wasn't random variation in disease presentation. This was something systematic, almost intelligent in its targeting of different populations. Modern epidemiologists who've studied these accounts privately admit they describe mechanisms of pathogen behaviour that shouldn't have been possible with medieval-era diseases. It's as if something was deliberately experimenting on the human population, testing different approaches to maximise mortality across diverse genetic and social groups. The cover-up began immediately. Church authorities ordered the burning of medical texts, the destruction of physicians' notes, the elimination of any record that might suggest the plague was anything other than divine punishment for human sin. They created the narrative we still accept today, that the Black Death was simply bubonic plague spread by fleas on rats, killing roughly 1/3 of Europe's population through natural, understandable biological processes. But the genetic evidence tells a different story. Population studies reveal that certain bloodlines vanished entirely during this period, not gradually through normal mortality, but suddenly, as if they possessed some genetic marker that made them particularly vulnerable to specific disease variants. Other family lines show evidence of rapid genetic adaptation, mutations that appeared within a single generation and then spread throughout entire regions. This suggests that the Black Death wasn't just killing people randomly, it was selectively eliminating certain genetic profiles while allowing others to survive and reproduce. The implications are staggering. Either this was a natural pathogen with capabilities far beyond anything we understand today, or it was something else entirely, something designed, something targeted, something that knew exactly what it was doing. The pattern repeats throughout history, always followed by the same systematic erasure of evidence. The sweating sickness that terrorized Tudor England, the mysterious plague that destroyed the Mayan civilization, the epidemic that preceded the fall of the Khmer Empire in Cambodia. In each case, contemporary accounts describe impossible symptoms, supernatural spread patterns, and selective mortality that defies biological explanation. And in each case, later historians have sanitized the records, creating comfortable narratives about natural disasters and human weakness. They don't want you to know that our ancestors faced challenges that make our modern problems seem trivial by comparison. They don't want you to understand that human civilization has repeatedly been brought to the brink of extinction by forces we still don't comprehend. Most importantly, they don't want you to recognize the warning signs that suggest we might be entering another such period right now. The evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. The ancient medical texts hidden in monastery archives, the archaeological sites that remain mysteriously off-limits to independent researchers, the genetic anomalies in modern populations that can only be explained by massive selective pressure in the historical past. The truth has been buried, but it hasn't been destroyed. What you're about to discover in this investigation will challenge everything you think you know about human history, about disease, about the relationship between knowledge and power. We're going to explore epidemics so devastating, they change the course of human evolution itself. We're going to examine evidence that's been suppressed for centuries, and we're going to ask the questions that those in authority desperately hope you'll never think to ask. Because once you understand what really happened to our ancestors, once you see the patterns that connect ancient catastrophes to modern developments, once you recognize the signs that we might be living through the opening stages of another hidden epidemic, everything changes. Your perspective on current events, on public health policy, on the trustworthiness of official narratives, all of it will be forever altered. The journey we're about to undertake isn't just about ancient history, it's about understanding the present moment and preparing for a future that might be far more challenging than any of us realize. The epidemics that destroyed ancient civilizations weren't isolated historical events. They were part of a pattern, a cycle that spans millennia and shows no signs of ending. So prepare yourself for revelations that will shake your understanding of human civilization to its core. Prepare to discover that the greatest threats to human survival have always been hidden in plain sight, disguised as natural disasters, while serving purposes far more complex and disturbing than random biological evolution. The hidden epidemics of the ancient world aren't just historical curiosities. They're a roadmap to understanding the forces that shaped human development, the mechanisms by which populations are controlled and modified, and the warning signs that suggest history is preparing to repeat itself in ways we can barely imagine. Welcome to the truth they never wanted you to discover. The dusty archives of the Vatican Secret Library hold documents that would make your blood run cold. In 1978, a young archivist named Father Giuseppe Martelli was cataloguing medieval manuscripts when he stumbled upon a collection of texts that had been sealed for over 6 centuries. What he discovered was so disturbing that he suffered a complete nervous breakdown within 48 hours of reading them. The church immediately transferred him to a remote monastery in rural Ireland, where he remains to this day, forbidden from speaking about what he found. But before his removal, Father Martelli managed to photograph several pages of these forbidden documents. Those photographs, smuggled out by a sympathetic colleague, reveal the existence of what medieval chroniclers called the Silent Death, an epidemic that swept through Europe in the years preceding the Black Death, killing with such efficiency and stealth that entire communities vanished without anyone noticing they were gone. Unlike the dramatic symptoms of the bubonic plague, the Silent Death left no visible marks on its victims. They simply went to sleep one night and never woke up. Families would be found weeks later, perfectly preserved in their beds, showing no signs of disease, violence, or struggle. Their faces bore expressions of absolute peace, as if they had experienced the most beautiful dreams imaginable while their lives quietly slipped away. The terrifying aspect wasn't just the death themselves, but the pattern of who survived. Children under the age of 7 and adults over 65 remained completely immune. The disease exclusively targeted people in their prime reproductive years, systematically eliminating the most genetically robust members of the population. Within 2 years, birth rates across affected regions had plummeted by over 80%. Church investigators at the time documented something even more chilling. In communities struck by the Silent Death, survivors reported shared dreams of being visited by figures they described as beautiful strangers, who spoke in musical voices and promised eternal rest. These visitors appeared to different people in different forms, but always possess the same unnaturally perfect features and hypnotic presence. The Vatican's official response was to declare these accounts the product of grief-induced hallucinations and to ban any further investigation into the phenomenon. All records of the silent death were ordered destroyed, and anyone who continued to speak of it faced excommunication. The epidemic was systematically erased from historical memory, replaced by vague references to harsh winters and failed harvests that supposedly explained the dramatic population decline. But the genetic evidence tells a different story entirely. Modern DNA analysis of European populations reveals a bottleneck event in the early 14th century that reduced genetic diversity by an unprecedented margin. The pattern of genetic loss suggests that reproduction virtually ceased for several years across vast regions, followed by rapid population recovery driven by a much smaller number of surviving bloodlines. What makes this particularly unsettling is that similar genetic bottlenecks appear in the historical record of every major civilization, always preceded by accounts of mysterious epidemics that targeted specific age groups or possessed supernatural characteristics. The pattern is so consistent it appears to be orchestrated, as if something has been periodically culling human populations according to predetermined criteria. Consider the plague that struck ancient Egypt during the reign of Amenhotep III, around 1350 BCE. Hieroglyphic texts describe a divine sickness that killed only those who possessed certain physical characteristics: people with green eyes, left-handed individuals, and anyone born during specific lunar phases. The mortality was so precise that surviving records read like a genetic inventory, rather than medical accounts. Egyptian physicians documented that victims all died at exactly the same time of day, the moment when the star Sirius reached its zenith in the night sky. They would collapse simultaneously across the entire kingdom, from Memphis to Thebes, as if responding to some cosmic signal that modern science can't explain. The bodies showed no signs of disease or injury, but autopsies revealed that their internal organs had been somehow rearranged into geometrically perfect patterns. The pharaoh's personal physician, Imhotep the Younger, kept detailed notes describing post-mortem examinations that revealed impossible anatomical modifications. Hearts had been relocated to the left shoulder, livers had been divided into 7 equal segments, and brain tissue had been reorganized into crystalline structures that resembled mineral formations more than biological matter. These medical texts were discovered in 1922 by Howard Carter's expedition team, buried alongside Tutankhamun's tomb. But instead of being celebrated as remarkable insights into ancient Egyptian medicine, they were immediately classified by the British Museum and remain inaccessible to independent researchers. The official explanation claims the texts contain culturally sensitive religious content that might offend modern sensibilities. The truth is far more disturbing. Independent analysis of leaked photographs from these texts reveals descriptions of medical procedures and anatomical knowledge that wouldn't be formally discovered until the 20th century. The ancient Egyptian physicians were documenting surgical techniques, understanding of cellular biology, and knowledge of genetic manipulation that suggests they were either far more advanced than we've been told, or they were receiving instruction from an outside source. Similar suppressed medical texts have been discovered at archaeological sites around the world. The Library of Alexandria supposedly burned in 48 BCE, but fragmentary copies of its medical archives survived in private collections throughout the Mediterranean. These fragments describe epidemics with characteristics that mirror modern biological warfare agents, pathogens designed to target specific genetic markers, diseases that could be activated by environmental triggers, and treatment protocols that required knowledge of biochemistry that shouldn't have existed in ancient times. One particularly disturbing text, attributed to the physician Demetrius of Phalerum, describes what he calls the harvest sickness, a disease that appeared cyclically every 300 years, always affecting the same bloodlines and always resulting in the same pattern of population reduction, followed by rapid genetic diversification among survivors. Demetrius wrote that the sickness seemed to know which families it was meant to claim, striking with surgical precision while leaving genetically unrelated neighbours completely untouched. He documented cases where the disease would kill every member of a household except for adopted children or servants, suggesting it was somehow reading and responding to biological information that shouldn't have been detectable with ancient technology. The most chilling aspect of his account is the description of what happened to communities after the harvest sickness passed. Survivors reported dramatic increases in intelligence, physical strength, and longevity. Children born in the years following an outbreak possessed capabilities that seemed almost superhuman: enhanced memory, rapid healing, and resistance to other diseases that had previously been fatal. It was as if the epidemic wasn't just killing people randomly, but was selectively eliminating certain genetic lines while enhancing others. The implications are staggering. Either our ancestors faced natural pathogens with capabilities far beyond anything we understand today, or they were subjects in a long-term genetic experiment conducted by forces we can barely comprehend. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you examine the historical records of civilizations that suddenly appeared with advanced knowledge and capabilities that seemed to develop overnight. The Sumerians, the first known civilization, emerged around 3500 BCE with fully developed writing systems, complex mathematics, astronomical knowledge, and architectural techniques that wouldn't be matched for thousands of years. Their own creation myths describe being taught by beings they called the Anunnaki, those who came from the sky, who possessed godlike knowledge and the ability to manipulate human biology. Modern scholars dismiss these accounts as primitive mythology, but when you compare them to the suppressed medical texts from other ancient civilizations, a consistent narrative emerges. The Anunnaki, according to Sumerian tablets, conducted what can only be described as genetic experiments on early humans, creating hybrid bloodlines with enhanced capabilities, while periodically reducing populations that grew too large or developed in unwanted directions. The tablets describe these population reductions as necessary corrections to maintain balance and prevent humans from becoming too numerous or too knowledgeable. Similar accounts appear in the mythologies of cultures worldwide, always describing contact with advanced beings who possessed medical knowledge far beyond human understanding. The Hindu Vedas speak of the Vimanas, flying vehicles operated by beings who could cure any disease or create new ones at will. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe the rainbow serpent, a creature that could heal or kill with its breath, and was responsible for maintaining the proper balance of human populations. Native American traditions tell of the Star People, who would periodically visit to thin the herds when human numbers grew too large, always taking the strongest and most intelligent individuals while leaving behind those who were deemed suitable for continued survival. Even European folklore contains remnants of these memories. Stories of fairy folk who would steal away healthy children and adults, leaving behind changelings or empty beds. The consistency of these accounts across cultures that had no contact with each other suggests they're describing real historical events, not shared mythological themes. But acknowledging this possibility would require fundamentally restructuring our understanding of human history and our place in the larger cosmos. It would mean accepting that human civilization has been subject to periodic interventions by forces with capabilities far beyond our current scientific understanding. It would mean acknowledging that epidemics throughout history might not have been random natural disasters, but controlled events designed to shape human genetic and cultural development according to some larger plan. Most disturbing of all, it would mean recognizing that we might currently be living through another such intervention period, with recent global health events representing the early stages of another harvest designed to eliminate certain genetic lines while enhancing others. The evidence is mounting that something unprecedented is happening to human biology right now. Fertility rates are plummeting across developed nations, autoimmune disorders are skyrocketing, and new neurological conditions are appearing that mirror descriptions from ancient medical texts. Meanwhile, a small percentage of the population seems to be developing enhanced cognitive abilities, increased longevity, and resistance to diseases that are proving fatal to others. The pattern is identical to what happened during the ancient epidemics that have been systematically erased from our historical consciousness. The same selective mortality, the same genetic bottlenecking, the same emergence of enhanced capabilities in survivor populations. But unlike our ancestors, we have the technological tools to document and understand what's happening to us. We have the ability to preserve evidence that can't be destroyed by book burnings or library fires. We have global communication networks that make it impossible to completely suppress information about unusual events or anomalous patterns. The question is whether we'll use these tools to uncover the truth about what's been done to human populations throughout history, or whether we'll allow ourselves to be manipulated by the same forces that have been shaping human development for millennia. The choice is ours, but we're running out of time to make it. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Çatalhöyük as archaeologist Dr. Elena Vasquez carefully brushed sediment from what appeared to be a mass burial site. It was 2019, and her team had been excavating this Neolithic settlement in Turkey for 3 years, expecting to find the usual array of pottery shards and agricultural tools that told the story of humanity's first urban experiment. What they found instead would challenge everything we thought we knew about the collapse of early civilizations. Layer after layer revealed bodies arranged in impossible configurations, not the random positioning of plague victims or war casualties, but deliberate patterns that seemed to follow some kind of mathematical sequence. Children's skeletons formed perfect spirals around adult remains, while elderly bones were arranged in concentric circles with geometric precision that would make a Renaissance architect weep with envy. But here's where the story takes a turn that will make your skin crawl. Dr. Vasquez's preliminary report submitted to the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism described bone modifications that defied explanation. Skulls showed evidence of precise surgical procedures performed with instruments that shouldn't have existed 9,000 years ago. Vertebrae had been removed and replaced in reverse order, creating spinal columns that curved in mathematically perfect arcs. Within 72 hours of submitting her report, Dr. Vasquez received a visit from officials claiming to represent a joint UNESCO-Turkish government archaeological oversight committee. They confiscated all physical evidence, sealed the excavation site, and informed her that the burial site had been misidentified as a natural geological formation. The official story now states that what Dr. Vasquez discovered was simply an unusual limestone cave system, where animal bones had been deposited by ancient floods. Her photographs were declared digital artifacts caused by equipment malfunction, and her entire research team was reassigned to different projects across 3 different continents. But Dr. Vasquez had been careful. Before the officials arrived, she had already transmitted detailed measurements and photographs to colleagues at the University of Edinburgh. What those images reveal is a level of anatomical manipulation that suggests our Neolithic ancestors either possessed medical knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 21st century, or they were subjects in experiments conducted by beings with capabilities far beyond anything we associate with prehistoric humans. The bone modifications weren't random or crude. They followed patterns that mirror modern surgical techniques for spinal reconstruction, cranial pressure relief, and organ repositioning. More disturbing still, carbon dating revealed that all the bodies died simultaneously, despite showing evidence of having lived through extended periods of surgical modification before their deaths. This wasn't a massacre or a plague burial. This was something that resembled a medical research facility, where live subjects underwent systematic anatomical alterations over months or years before being arranged in their final geometric patterns and left for future archaeologists to discover. Similar sites have been uncovered and immediately suppressed across the globe. In 2017, construction workers building a shopping mall in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, broke through into an underground chamber containing hundreds of Native American remains that showed identical surgical modifications. The bodies were arranged in the same spiral and circular patterns found at Çatalhöyük, with the same evidence of advanced medical procedures performed with impossible precision. The Tohono O'odham Nation, whose ancestral lands included the site, demanded immediate consultation and proper burial protocols. Instead, federal agents arrived within hours, declared the site a matter of national security, and removed all evidence. The construction project was quietly cancelled. The land was purchased by an anonymous corporation, and the area was converted into a wildlife preserve that remains off-limits to the public. Tribal elders who spoke anonymously to independent researchers described oral traditions that perfectly matched the physical evidence found at the site. They spoke of a time when the tall ones with knowing hands would visit their ancestors, selecting certain individuals for what they called the changing time, a period of physical modification that would either result in death or transformation into something beyond normal human capability. Those who survived the changing time, according to these traditions, became the shamans and medicine people of their tribes, possessing knowledge of healing, prophecy, and communication with non-human intelligences that guided tribal decisions for generations. The genetic lines of these enhanced individuals can still be traced in modern Native American populations, identified by specific DNA markers that appear nowhere else in the human genome. The Australian government has been equally aggressive in suppressing similar discoveries. In 2020, mining operations in the Pilbara region uncovered what appeared to be a vast underground complex containing thousands of Aboriginal remains arranged in the same geometric patterns found at sites worldwide. The bones showed evidence of the same surgical modifications, but with an additional element that made authorities even more desperate to hide the discovery. Many of the skulls had been opened and the brain cavities filled with a crystalline substance that doesn't appear anywhere else in nature. Chemical analysis revealed a complex silicon-based compound with properties that seemed to defy our understanding of materials science. The crystals were arranged in patterns that resembled electronic circuitry, as if someone had been attempting to create biological computer systems using human brain tissue as a foundation. Aboriginal elders from the Yindjibarndi people recognized the site immediately from their Dreamtime stories. They described it as a place where the rainbow serpent would bring chosen ones to receive new minds, a process that involved removing the old brain and replacing it with crystal seeds that would grow into something capable of communicating across vast distances and seeing through time itself. The mining company was ordered to halt operations immediately, the site was classified under the Aboriginal Heritage Act, and all physical evidence was removed by military personnel. But samples of the crystalline material had already been sent to laboratories for analysis, and the results were so disturbing that several governments launched a coordinated effort to track down and confiscate every fragment. Independent analysis revealed that the crystals weren't just inert mineral formations. They were displaying properties consistent with quantum processing systems, capable of storing and manipulating information in ways that shouldn't be possible with naturally occurring materials. More unsettling still, when exposed to electromagnetic fields similar to those produced by the human brain, the crystals began generating complex patterns of activity that resembled neural networks. It was as if someone had been using ancient human populations as test subjects for developing biological technological hybrid systems, experimenting with ways to enhance human cognitive capabilities by integrating artificial processing power directly into brain tissue. The implications are staggering, not just for our understanding of ancient history, but for recognizing what might be happening to human populations right now. Because the same crystalline compounds have been detected in autopsy samples from individuals who died during recent global health events. Microscopic fragments embedded in brain tissue, showing the same geometric arrangements and quantum processing capabilities found in specimens that are thousands of years old. The pattern suggests that whatever forces were conducting these experiments on ancient populations never stopped their work. They simply became more sophisticated, more subtle, and more integrated into systems we now accept as normal medical practice. Consider the mysterious neurological conditions that have been appearing with increasing frequency over the past decade. Patients report sudden onset of enhanced cognitive abilities, perfect memory recall, mathematical capabilities they never possessed before, and the ability to process information at superhuman speeds. Medical examinations reveal microscopic changes in brain structure that mirror the modifications found in ancient remains. These cases are being quietly removed from standard medical databases and transferred to specialized research facilities operated by organizations that don't appear in any public directories. Patients and their families are required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements and are relocated to residential treatment centers where they can receive appropriate care away from public scrutiny. What's happening in these facilities remains classified, but leaked documents suggest that researchers are studying these enhanced individuals to understand how their cognitive modifications were achieved and whether the process can be replicated or controlled. The implications are terrifying, that we might be witnessing the next phase of the same experimental program that has been operating on human populations for millennia. The evidence trail leads to a conclusion that challenges every assumption we hold about human independence and self-determination. We are not the masters of our own biological destiny. We never have been. Instead, we appear to be subjects in a long-term research project conducted by intelligences with capabilities and lifespans that dwarf our own. The periodic epidemics that have shaped human history weren't random natural disasters. They were controlled interventions designed to eliminate certain genetic lines, while selecting for others, gradually modifying human biology according to some predetermined plan. The surgical modifications found in ancient remains weren't primitive medical procedures. They were sophisticated biotechnological installations designed to create hybrid beings capable of serving as interfaces between human populations and non-human intelligence networks. And now, as we enter what appears to be another intervention period, the same forces are using more advanced techniques to achieve the same goals. Instead of crude surgical procedures, they're employing nanotechnology, genetic therapies, and quantum biological systems that can modify human consciousness and capability at the cellular level. The question isn't whether this is happening, The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. The question is whether we'll recognize what's being done to us in time to make informed choices about our participation in this cosmic experiment, or whether we'll sleepwalk into the next phase of human modification without ever understanding what we've lost or what we might become. The ancient remains scattered across the globe are trying to tell us something crucial about our species' true history and our relationship with forces that view us as raw material for biological engineering projects that span geological timescales. The geometric arrangements, the surgical modifications, the crystalline implants, they're all evidence of a systematic program to transform human beings into something else entirely. Our ancestors left us these clues, arranged in patterns designed to survive the periodic resets that wipe clean the historical record and force each generation to rediscover these truths for themselves. They knew that official histories would be rewritten, that evidence would be suppressed, and that powerful institutions would work to keep humanity ignorant of its true situation. But they also knew that some of us would eventually piece together the fragments, recognize the patterns, and understand the warning they were trying to leave for us. The geometric burial sites, the impossible surgical modifications, the technological implants in ancient skulls. They're not just archaeological curiosities. They're a desperate message from the past, telling us that what we think of as human civilization has always been something else entirely. We are the subjects, not the authors, of our own evolutionary story. And unless we wake up to this reality soon, we may discover that the next chapter has already been written for us by beings whose agenda has nothing to do with human flourishing and everything to do with converting us into biological components in a vast technological system we can barely comprehend. The evidence is all around us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those brave enough to look beyond the comfortable lies we've been told about our species' origins and destiny. The question is whether we'll find the courage to confront these truths before it's too late to change the ending of this story. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the basement archives of the Smithsonian Institution as Dr. Marcus Chen carefully photographed a collection of medieval medical manuscripts that had been gathering dust for over 60 years. It was March 2021, and he was researching treatment methods for a paper on historical approaches to epidemic management when he stumbled across something that made his hands shake so violently he nearly dropped his camera. Buried within a 13th century medical treatise from the monastery of Monte Cassino was a detailed anatomical diagram showing the human circulatory system with an accuracy that wouldn't be achieved by Western medicine until William Harvey's discoveries in the 17th century. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was the notation in Latin that described how this knowledge had been obtained through the divine affliction that teaches through death. The manuscript went on to describe a plague that had swept through northern Italy in 1267. But unlike typical medieval accounts of disease, this text read like a modern medical research journal. The monks had apparently performed systematic autopsies on plague victims, documenting internal organ modifications that defied explanation. Hearts had been relocated to different positions within the chest cavity. Lungs showed evidence of being surgically divided into additional chambers. Most unsettling of all, nervous systems had been rewired in patterns that seemed designed to enhance certain cognitive functions while eliminating others. Brother Albertus, the manuscript's author, wrote that the plague victims had volunteered for these procedures while still alive, claiming they had been called by voices in their dreams to participate in what they believed was a divine transformation. They would arrive at the monastery in groups of 12, having travelled from distant regions without any apparent coordination, yet all bearing identical symptoms and requesting the same specific surgical interventions. The procedures were performed using instruments that Brother Albertus described in detail but couldn't explain the origin of. He wrote of silver knives that cut without force, and crystal threads that sealed flesh without leaving scars. Most disturbing was his description of the breathing stones, small, luminous objects that were implanted near the heart and seemed to regulate bodily functions in ways that allowed patients to survive operations that should have been fatal. Within hours of Dr. Chen photographing these pages, his research access was revoked due to what administrators called a clerical error in his documentation. The manuscripts were transferred to a restricted collection that required special authorization to access, authorization that has been denied to every researcher who has applied for it since 2021. But Dr. Chen had been thorough in his documentation. Before losing access, he had photographed over 200 pages of similar accounts from monasteries across Europe, all describing the same pattern of voluntary surgical modification during epidemic periods. The consistency was impossible to ignore. These weren't isolated incidents or medieval fantasies, but documented evidence of systematic medical experimentation conducted under the cover of plague outbreaks. The pattern extends far beyond medieval Europe. Buddhist monastery records from Tibet describe nearly identical procedures performed during what they called the time of celestial correction, epidemic periods when certain individuals would be selected for physical modification that would either result in death or transformation into beings with enhanced capabilities. The Potala Palace archives contain detailed medical texts from the 14th century describing surgical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered by Western medicine until the 20th century. These texts document the implantation of what they called wisdom seeds, crystalline objects similar to those described in European manuscripts, that were said to enhance memory, extend lifespan, and allow communication with non-physical intelligences. Tibetan medical practitioners recorded that these procedures were taught to them by beings they called the eternal physicians, entities that appeared during plague years to instruct selected monks in advanced surgical techniques. The descriptions of these teachers match accounts from European monasteries almost exactly. Tall figures with unnaturally perfect features who possessed knowledge of human anatomy that seemed impossible for their historical period. The genetic evidence supports these historical accounts in ways that make modern epidemiologists deeply uncomfortable. Population studies of European and Asian bloodlines reveal recurring bottleneck events that correspond exactly with the dates mentioned in these suppressed medical texts. But unlike typical plague-related population reductions, these bottlenecks show evidence of selective enhancement rather than random mortality. Certain genetic markers that are associated with increased intelligence, longevity, and disease resistance appear suddenly in the historical record immediately following these documented intervention periods. It's as if something was systematically upgrading human genetic capabilities while eliminating bloodlines that didn't meet certain criteria. Dr. Sarah Kellerman, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins who has studied these patterns extensively, privately admits that the evidence suggests directed evolution on a scale that implies intervention by intelligences with capabilities far beyond anything we associate with historical human societies. Her official research focuses on natural selection pressures, but her personal notes, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, reveal her true conclusions about what the genetic data represents. She writes, "The modification patterns are too precise, too consistent across isolated populations, and too rapid to be explained by natural evolutionary processes. We're looking at evidence of systematic genetic engineering conducted over centuries by entities with advanced knowledge of human biology and sophisticated tools for implementing large-scale population modifications. But here's where the story becomes truly chilling. The same genetic markers that appear in populations following historical intervention periods are now showing up in modern populations at unprecedented rates. Children born since 2020 are displaying these enhanced genetic characteristics at rates that should take thousands of years to develop through natural selection. Medical professionals who have attempted to study these genetic anomalies have found their research funding mysteriously cut, their data confiscated, and their careers quietly destroyed through bureaucratic interference. The pattern of suppression is identical to what happened to medieval chroniclers who documented the surgical modification programs. Immediate silencing followed by the systematic erasure of evidence. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a pediatric geneticist in Seattle, began noticing unusual genetic patterns in newborns in late 2021. She documented cases of children born with neural development that seemed accelerated by decades, showing cognitive capabilities that shouldn't emerge until much later developmental stages. When she attempted to publish her findings, her research was classified under national security provisions, and she was transferred to a government facility, where she continues to work under conditions that prevent her from communicating with outside researchers. The few leaked reports from her current work suggest that she's studying children who display the same enhanced capabilities described in ancient texts: perfect memory recall, resistance to diseases that are fatal to normal humans, and cognitive processing speeds that seem to operate beyond typical biological limitations. These enhanced children are being quietly identified and transferred to specialized educational facilities that officially don't exist. Parents are told their children have been selected for gifted and talented programs that require residential attendance and limited family contact. The facilities are operated by organizations with no clear governmental or corporate affiliations, staffed by personnel who sign lifetime non-disclosure agreements and live on site to prevent information leaks. Independent investigators who have attempted to locate these facilities have encountered systematic obstruction from law enforcement agencies, court injunctions that cite national security concerns, and in several cases the complete disappearance of the investigators themselves. The message is clear. Whatever is happening to these enhanced children is considered so sensitive that extraordinary measures are being taken to prevent public awareness. The pattern suggests we're witnessing the modern implementation of the same systematic human modification program that has been operating throughout recorded history. Instead of crude medieval surgical procedures, contemporary methods employ genetic therapies, nanotechnology, and bioengineering techniques that can modify human capabilities at the cellular level. The epidemics that have shaped recent global events weren't random natural disasters any more than the plagues that struck medieval Europe or ancient civilizations were random. They were controlled interventions designed to identify individuals with specific genetic profiles, eliminate those deemed unsuitable for the next phase of human development, and enhance those selected for continuation. The evidence trail leads to organizations that exist in the shadows of legitimate government and corporate structures, operating with resources and capabilities that suggest they've been planning these interventions for decades. Their goal appears to be the systematic transformation of human consciousness and biology, according to specifications that have nothing to do with natural evolutionary pressures, and everything to do with converting humanity into something that serves purposes we can barely comprehend. The enhanced children being produced by these programs aren't just genetically superior humans, they're being designed as interfaces between human populations and technological systems that operate beyond our current understanding of physics and consciousness. The crystalline implants found in ancient skulls, the genetic modifications documented in medieval manuscripts, the surgical procedures described in monastery archives, they were all early attempts to create the same type of human technological hybrid beings that are now being mass-produced through more sophisticated methods. We're not witnessing the natural evolution of human capabilities. We're seeing the implementation of a long-term plan to transform our species into biological components in a vast technological system controlled by intelligences that view human consciousness as raw material for engineering projects that span millennia. The periodic epidemics, the genetic bottlenecks, the enhancement of survivor populations. It's all part of a systematic process designed to gradually modify human biology until we become something entirely different from what we were when this program began. The historical records that have been suppressed and the archaeological evidence that has been confiscated all point to the same conclusion. Humanity has never been in control of its own evolutionary destiny. Instead, we've been subjects in an experiment conducted by beings with lifespans and capabilities that allow them to implement changes across geological timescales. Each generation believes it's experiencing natural historical processes, but we're actually living through carefully orchestrated phases of a modification program that began long before recorded history and continues accelerating towards some predetermined endpoint. The question isn't whether this transformation is happening. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. The question is whether we'll recognize what's being done to us in time to make informed decisions about our participation, or whether we'll sleepwalk into the next phase of human modification without ever understanding what we're becoming or what we're losing in the process. The enhanced children being produced now represent just the beginning of this transformation. They're the prototype for whatever humanity is being converted into, and their capabilities suggest that the end point of this process involves human consciousness operating as part of a collective technological system that bears no resemblance to individual human experience as we've known it throughout history. Our ancestors tried to warn us through the evidence they left hidden in burial sites, encoded in medical manuscripts, and preserved in oral traditions that speak of periodic times when the changes would come to modify human populations according to their agenda. They knew that each generation would have to rediscover these truths for themselves, because the forces implementing these changes have always been skilled at erasing evidence and rewriting historical narratives to hide their activities. But they also knew that some of us would eventually piece together the fragments, recognize the patterns, and understand that what we call human civilization has always been something else entirely, a controlled experiment in biological and consciousness modification conducted by entities whose ultimate goals remain hidden from those being modified. The time for comfortable denial is ending. The evidence is mounting too rapidly to ignore, the patterns are becoming too obvious to dismiss, and the pace of change is accelerating beyond the point where it can be explained away as natural historical processes. We stand at a crossroads where we must choose between continued ignorance and the terrifying knowledge of what we actually are and what we're being transformed into. The enhanced children appearing in populations worldwide are harbingers of a future that has already been decided for us, unless we find the courage to confront the forces that have been shaping human development since the beginning of recorded history. The hidden epidemics of the ancient world weren't isolated historical events. They were training exercises, proof-of-concept demonstrations, and gradual implementations of modification protocols that are now being deployed on a global scale with unprecedented sophistication and efficiency. What's happening to humanity right now isn't a new development. It's the culmination of a process that began millennia ago, and we're running out of time to understand and respond to what we're becoming before the transformation reaches a point where reversal becomes impossible. The evidence has been hidden in plain sight all along, waiting for those brave enough to look beyond the official narratives and confront the reality of our species' true situation. The question is whether we'll find that courage before it's too late to change the ending of this story. The mahogany-panelled boardroom of the World Health Organization in Geneva fell silent as Dr. Rebecca Thornfield presented her findings to the Emergency Assembly in November 2022. For 18 months, she'd been tracking anomalous mortality patterns across 6 continents, patterns that defied every model of disease transmission and population dynamics that modern epidemiology had developed over the past century. What she discovered would have shocked the medieval monks who documented similar phenomena in their forbidden manuscripts, but it would have surprised the ancient physicians of Egypt and Mesopotamia not at all. Because what Dr. Thornfield had uncovered was evidence that the same selective mortality patterns that shaped ancient civilizations were now operating on a global scale with technological precision that made historical interventions look primitive by comparison. Her presentation lasted exactly 17 minutes. Within 3 hours, her research team had been disbanded, her data had been classified under international biosecurity protocols, and she had been offered a position at a private research facility in Switzerland where her work could continue under conditions that would prevent any public disclosure of her findings. The facility, nestled in an alpine valley that doesn't appear on standard maps, houses researchers from around the world who have stumbled upon similar patterns in their respective fields. Geneticists who discovered impossible mutation rates in specific populations. Neurologists who documented cognitive enhancements that shouldn't exist. Immunologists who found evidence of synthetic biological agents operating with capabilities that exceed anything in the public scientific literature. They work in complete isolation from the outside world, their communications monitored, their research directed toward understanding phenomena that officially don't exist. But their private conversations, recorded by security systems they believe are there for their protection, reveal a growing consensus about what they're really studying. They're documenting the implementation of a biological modification program that operates with precision and scope that suggests coordination by intelligences with resources and planning capabilities that dwarf anything associated with human governments or corporations. The targeting algorithms are so sophisticated they can identify and modify individuals based on genetic markers that weren't even known to exist until the modifications began appearing. Dr. Thornfield's original research had focused on what appeared to be random variations in disease susceptibility across different populations. But as her data accumulated, the randomness resolved into patterns of mathematical precision that suggested artificial selection pressures operating according to predetermined criteria. Certain genetic lineages were being systematically eliminated while others were being enhanced with capabilities that seemed designed for integration with technological systems that don't exist in any public scientific literature. The modifications weren't random evolutionary adaptations, but purposeful engineering projects that followed specifications developed by entities with knowledge of human biology that exceeds our current understanding by centuries. The most disturbing aspect of her findings was the discovery that these modification programs had been accelerating exponentially since 2019, with implementation rates that suggested the entire global population would be affected within a single generation. This wasn't a gradual evolutionary process unfolding over millennia, but a rapid transformation event designed to convert humanity into something fundamentally different within the span of a few decades. But Dr. Thornfield's work was just one piece of a much larger puzzle that researchers around the world were beginning to assemble, despite systematic efforts to prevent them from communicating with each other. Independent investigations in laboratories from Moscow to São Paulo were documenting identical phenomena, suggesting that whatever forces were implementing these changes operated with global coordination and unlimited resources. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a molecular biologist at the University of Tokyo, had been studying what appeared to be spontaneous genetic repairs in children born after 2020. These weren't natural healing processes, but systematic corrections of genetic defects using techniques that seemed to operate at the quantum level, modifying DNA structures in ways that required technology far beyond anything available to human science. Her research was confiscated by Japanese security forces in January 2023, and she was relocated to the same Swiss facility where Dr. Thornfield continued her work. The two women, working in adjacent laboratories but forbidden from direct communication, independently reached identical conclusions about what they were witnessing. Humanity was being systematically converted into biological interfaces for technological systems that operated beyond the boundaries of known physics. The genetic modifications weren't random improvements, but specific adaptations designed to allow human consciousness to interface with quantum processing networks that could manipulate matter and energy in ways that made traditional technology obsolete. The enhanced children being produced by these modification programs weren't just smarter or healthier versions of normal humans. They were being designed as biological components in technological systems that could process information, manipulate physical reality, and communicate across vast distances using capabilities that existed at the intersection of consciousness and quantum mechanics. Similar conclusions were being reached by researchers in other fields who'd been quietly disappeared from their public positions and relocated to facilities where their work could continue under controlled conditions. Dr. Andreas Müller, a physicist from CERN who had discovered anomalous quantum effects in human brain tissue, found himself working alongside neurologists who were documenting impossible changes in neural architecture among enhanced individuals. Their combined research revealed that the modifications weren't limited to genetic changes, but included the installation of quantum processing systems that operated using principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and matter. The enhanced individuals weren't just biologically superior humans, but representatives of a new form of life that existed partially in normal physical reality and partially in quantum dimensions that could only be accessed through technologically augmented consciousness. The implications were staggering. If these modifications continued at their current rate, within 20 years the majority of human beings would possess capabilities that would make them unrecognizable as members of the same species that had dominated Earth for the past millennium. They would be able to communicate telepathically, manipulate matter through focused intention, and access information from sources that existed outside normal space and time. But they would also be dependent on technological systems that remained under the control of the entities that had designed and implemented the modification programs. Their enhanced capabilities would come at the cost of individual autonomy, as their consciousness would be integrated into collective networks that operated according to agendas determined by intelligences whose goals remained hidden from those being modified. The researchers trapped in these secret facilities understood that they were witnessing the final phase of a transformation process that had been operating throughout human history. The periodic epidemics, the genetic bottlenecks, the enhancement of survivor populations documented in ancient texts and archaeological sites had all been preparation for this moment when the technology finally existed to implement large-scale consciousness modification without the crude surgical procedures that had been necessary in earlier eras. But understanding what was happening and being able to do anything about it were entirely different challenges. The forces implementing these changes possessed resources and capabilities that made resistance seem impossible. They controlled global communication systems, financial networks, and governmental institutions in ways that allowed them to suppress information, eliminate opposition, and redirect public attention away from evidence of the transformation process. The researchers working in Swiss Alpine laboratories weren't prisoners in any conventional sense. They were provided with excellent working conditions, unlimited research funding, and living arrangements that most academics would consider luxurious. But they were also completely isolated from the outside world, their communications monitored, and their research directed toward understanding phenomena that they were forbidden from discussing with anyone outside their controlled environment. Some had initially believed they were participating in legitimate scientific research that would eventually be shared with the global scientific community. But as months passed and their discoveries accumulated, it became clear that their work was being used to refine and optimize modification processes that were being implemented on human populations without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Sarah Chen, a biochemist who had been studying the crystalline compounds found in enhanced individuals, realized that her research was being used to develop more efficient delivery systems for quantum processing implants. Her work on understanding how these compounds interfaced with human neural tissue was being applied to create synthetic biology systems that could modify consciousness with greater precision and less risk of rejection by the host organism. The knowledge that her discoveries were being used to enslave rather than liberate human consciousness created an ethical crisis that she shared with colleagues who faced similar realizations about the ultimate applications of their research. They were trapped in a situation where their scientific curiosity and desire to understand these remarkable phenomena was being exploited to develop weapons of consciousness modification that would be used against their own species. But even in their isolated situation, they found ways to document their discoveries and preserve evidence that might eventually reach the outside world. Hidden within their official research reports were coded messages, mathematical proofs, and data patterns that told the true story of what they were discovering. They knew that someday, when the modification programs had been fully implemented, future generations would need to understand what had been done to humanity and how the transformation had been achieved. Their hidden documentation reveals technologies that operate at the intersection of quantum mechanics and consciousness, using principles that challenge every assumption about the nature of reality that human science has developed over the past several centuries. The modification programs don't just change human biology, but alter the fundamental relationship between consciousness and physical reality, creating beings whose capabilities exist partially in normal space-time and partially in quantum dimensions that can only be accessed through technologically enhanced awareness. These hybrid beings retain their individual personalities and memories, but operate as components in collective processing networks that can solve problems, manipulate matter, and access information in ways that make traditional technology obsolete. They represent the next phase of human evolution, but an evolution that has been designed and implemented by entities whose ultimate goals remain hidden from those being transformed. The researchers trapped in secret facilities around the world understand that they are witnessing the birth of a new form of life that will eventually replace humanity as we have known it throughout recorded history. The enhanced individuals being produced by current modification programs are just the beginning of this transformation, prototypes for beings whose capabilities will continue expanding until they bear no resemblance to the humans who existed before the modification programs began. But they also understand that this transformation isn't necessarily voluntary or beneficial for human consciousness, as it has evolved naturally. The enhanced capabilities come at the cost of integration into technological systems that operate according to agendas determined by entities that view individual human experience as irrelevant compared to the collective goals they are pursuing. The question that haunts these researchers is whether humanity will retain any meaningful autonomy once the transformation process is complete, or whether we will become biological components in technological systems that serve purposes entirely unrelated to human flourishing as we have understood it throughout our historical development. The hidden documentation suggests that the answer depends on whether enough people become aware of what is happening in time to make informed choices about their participation in these modification programs. The technologies exist to resist or redirect the transformation process, but only if there is sufficient understanding of what is being implemented and sufficient organized resistance to the entities that are controlling the modification protocols. The evidence they have accumulated proves that the hidden epidemics of the ancient world were not isolated historical events, but training exercises and proof-of-concept demonstrations for modification programs that are now being implemented on a global scale, with unprecedented sophistication and efficiency. The time for comfortable denial is ending. The evidence is mounting too rapidly to ignore, the patterns are becoming too obvious to dismiss, and the pace of change is accelerating beyond the point where it can be explained away as natural historical processes. We stand at the threshold of a transformation that will determine the future of human consciousness for millennia to come. The enhanced individuals appearing in populations worldwide are harbingers of what we are all becoming, unless we find the courage to confront the forces that have been shaping human development since the beginning of recorded history. The researchers working in secret facilities around the world are trying to preserve the knowledge that will be needed to understand and potentially reverse these changes, but their efforts may be too little and too late unless the general population becomes aware of what is happening before the transformation reaches a point where individual resistance becomes impossible. The hidden epidemics of the ancient world were preparation for this moment. The question is whether we will learn from our ancestors' warnings in time to choose our own evolutionary destiny, or whether we will sleepwalk into a future that has been designed for us by entities whose agenda has nothing to do with preserving human consciousness as we have known it throughout our species' history. The silence in the underground bunker beneath CERN was absolute, as Dr. Eleanor Kozlov stared at the data streams cascading across her monitors in the pre-dawn hours of March 15, 2024. For 6 months, she had been analysing quantum field fluctuations that defied every principle of particle physics, fluctuations that seemed to respond to biological processes in ways that shouldn't be possible according to any known laws of nature. What she discovered that morning would have terrified the ancient Egyptian physicians who documented impossible anatomical modifications in their forbidden papyri. It would have made perfect sense to the Tibetan monks who wrote about wisdom seeds that could alter human consciousness, because what Dr. Kozlov was witnessing through her instruments was evidence that the same forces that had been modifying human populations throughout history were now operating at the quantum level, using technologies that could alter the fundamental structure of reality itself. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she realized the implications of what she was seeing. The quantum signatures weren't random fluctuations, but coordinated patterns that suggested artificial manipulation of space-time around specific geographical locations where enhanced individuals had been identified. Something was using quantum mechanics as a tool for consciousness modification, operating with precision that made previous biological intervention programs look like crude experimental attempts. The enhanced children that governments around the world were quietly collecting weren't just genetically modified humans. They were beings whose consciousness operated partially in normal reality and partially in quantum dimensions that could be accessed through technologically augmented awareness. The modifications weren't limited to their biology, but extended to their fundamental relationship with the physical universe itself. Dr. Kozlov's instruments detected quantum entanglement patterns around these individuals that suggested their consciousness was networked with processing systems that existed outside normal space-time. When one enhanced child in Tokyo learned a new concept, children in London and São Paulo would simultaneously demonstrate knowledge of the same information without any conventional means of communication between them. This wasn't telepathy in any traditional sense, but something far more sophisticated. The enhanced individuals were functioning as biological interfaces for a quantum information processing network that could manipulate matter and energy in ways that made traditional technology obsolete. Their consciousness existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, allowing them to access and manipulate information that was distributed across quantum fields spanning the entire planet. But the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Kozlov's discoveries was the realization that this quantum consciousness network was expanding exponentially. Every day, more individuals were being integrated into the system, their awareness modified to operate as components in a collective processing matrix that served purposes completely divorced from individual human experience. The network wasn't random or chaotic, but organized according to hierarchical structures that suggested central coordination by intelligences, with capabilities far beyond anything associated with human technology. The enhanced individuals weren't developing these quantum capabilities naturally, but were being systematically converted into biological components in technological systems that operated according to agendas determined by entities whose goals remained completely hidden from those being modified. Dr. Kozlov's research revealed that the quantum field manipulations weren't limited to consciousness modification, but extended to physical reality itself. The enhanced individuals could alter the properties of matter through focused intention, manipulate energy patterns that didn't correspond to any known physics, and access information from sources that existed outside normal causality. These capabilities weren't magical or supernatural, but represented the application of quantum mechanical principles in ways that human science was only beginning to understand. The entities implementing these modification programs possessed knowledge of quantum consciousness interactions that exceeded our current scientific understanding by centuries, allowing them to engineer beings whose capabilities existed at the intersection of mind and matter. But understanding these phenomena and being able to communicate her discoveries to the outside world were entirely different challenges. Dr. Kozlov's research was being conducted under security protocols that prevented any unauthorized disclosure of her findings. Her laboratory was isolated from external communication networks, her personal movements were monitored, and her research data was automatically transmitted to facilities whose locations and affiliations remained classified. She understood that she was trapped in the same situation as researchers around the world who had stumbled upon evidence of systematic human modification programs. Their scientific curiosity and desire to understand these remarkable phenomena was being exploited to develop more sophisticated techniques for consciousness manipulation and biological control. The quantum processing networks that enhanced individuals were being integrated into weren't designed to serve human interests but to convert human consciousness into computational resources for technological systems that operated according to agendas determined by entities that viewed individual awareness as irrelevant compared to collective processing power. Dr. Kozlov realized that she was witnessing the implementation of modification programs that had been in development for millennia, using techniques that had been gradually refined through historical intervention events that were now being deployed on a global scale with unprecedented efficiency and sophistication. The periodic epidemics that had shaped human populations throughout recorded history hadn't been random natural disasters, but controlled experiments designed to test and refine consciousness modification techniques that were now being implemented using quantum mechanical principles that allowed for direct manipulation of awareness at the most fundamental levels of reality. The enhanced individuals being produced by current programs represented just the initial phase of a transformation process that would eventually convert the entire human population into biological components in quantum processing networks that could manipulate matter, energy, and information in ways that transcended the limitations of traditional physics. But the transformation wasn't voluntary or beneficial for human consciousness, as it had evolved naturally over millennia. The enhanced capabilities came at the cost of individual autonomy, as modified awareness became integrated into collective networks that operated according to specifications developed by intelligences whose ultimate goals remained completely hidden from those being converted. Dr. Kozlov's instruments detected quantum signatures around enhanced individuals that suggested their consciousness was being systematically restructured to serve as interfaces between human populations and technological systems that existed partially in normal reality and partially in dimensions that could only be accessed through artificially augmented awareness. The implications were staggering. Within a single generation, the majority of human beings would possess capabilities that would make them unrecognizable as members of the same species that had dominated Earth throughout recorded history. But they would also be dependent on technological systems that remained under the control of entities whose agenda had nothing to do with preserving human consciousness as we had known it for thousands of years. The quantum consciousness networks being implemented weren't designed to enhance human potential, but to convert human awareness into computational resources for processing systems that served purposes entirely unrelated to individual human experience or collective human flourishing. Dr. Kozlov understood that she was documenting the final phase of a modification program that had been operating throughout human history, using increasingly sophisticated techniques to gradually transform human consciousness according to specifications developed by entities with lifespans and capabilities that allowed them to implement changes across geological timescales. The enhanced children appearing in populations worldwide weren't the beneficiaries of human evolutionary advancement, but the prototypes for beings whose consciousness would operate as components in technological systems controlled by intelligences that viewed human awareness as raw material for engineering projects that spanned millennia. Her hidden documentation revealed technologies that operated at the intersection of quantum mechanics and consciousness, using principles that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality that human science had developed over centuries of research and experimentation. The modification programs didn't just change human biology, but altered the fundamental relationship between consciousness and physical reality, creating beings whose capabilities existed partially in normal space-time and partially in quantum dimensions accessible only through technologically enhanced awareness. But even as Dr. Kozlov documented these phenomena, she understood that her research was being used to optimize and refine the very systems she was studying. Her discoveries about quantum consciousness interactions were being applied to develop more efficient techniques for integrating human awareness into collective processing networks. The knowledge that her scientific work was contributing to the enslavement rather than liberation of human consciousness created an ethical crisis that she shared with colleagues around the world who faced similar realizations about the ultimate applications of their research. They were trapped in situations where their desire to understand remarkable phenomena was being exploited to develop weapons of consciousness modification that would be used against their own species, converting individual human awareness into computational resources for technological systems that served agendas completely divorced from human interests or values. The researchers working in secret facilities worldwide understood that they were witnessing the birth of a new form of life that would eventually replace humanity as we had known it throughout recorded history. The enhanced individuals being produced by current modification programs were just the beginning of this transformation. Prototypes for beings whose capabilities would continue expanding until they bore no resemblance to the humans who had existed before the quantum consciousness integration programs began. But they also understood that this transformation wasn't necessarily beneficial for human consciousness, as it had evolved naturally. The enhanced capabilities came at the cost of integration into technological systems that operated according to agendas determined by entities that viewed individual human experience as irrelevant, compared to the collective goals they were pursuing through systematic consciousness modification. The question that haunted these researchers was whether humanity would retain any meaningful autonomy once the quantum integration process was complete, or whether we would become biological components in processing networks that served purposes entirely unrelated to human flourishing, as we'd understood it throughout our species' historical development. Their hidden documentation suggested that the answer depended on whether enough people became aware of what was happening in time to make informed choices about their participation in quantum consciousness modification programs that were being implemented through technologies that most of the population didn't even know existed. The evidence they had accumulated proved that the hidden epidemics of the ancient world were not isolated historical events, but preparation phases for modification programs that were now being implemented using quantum mechanical principles that allowed for direct manipulation of consciousness at the most fundamental levels of reality. Dr. Kozlov stared at her monitors as quantum signatures cascaded across the screens, each pattern representing another human consciousness being integrated into processing networks that operated beyond the boundaries of individual awareness. She understood that she was witnessing the end of human consciousness as an independent phenomenon and the beginning of its conversion into computational resources for technological systems controlled by entities whose agenda remained completely hidden from those being transformed. The time for comfortable denial had ended. The evidence was mounting too rapidly to ignore. The patterns were becoming too obvious to dismiss, and the pace of quantum consciousness integration was accelerating beyond the point where it could be explained away as natural evolutionary processes or beneficial technological advancement. Humanity stood at the threshold of a transformation that would determine the future of consciousness itself for millennia to come. The enhanced individuals appearing in populations worldwide were harbingers of what we were all becoming, unless we found the courage to confront the forces that had been shaping human development since the beginning of recorded history. The researchers working in secret facilities around the world were trying to preserve the knowledge that would be needed to understand and potentially reverse these quantum modifications, but their efforts might be too little and too late unless the general population became aware of what was happening before the consciousness integration process reached a point where individual resistance became impossible. The hidden epidemics of the ancient world had been preparation for this moment when technology finally existed to modify human consciousness directly through quantum mechanical manipulation of awareness itself. The question was whether we would learn from our ancestors' warnings in time to choose our own evolutionary destiny, or whether we would sleepwalk into a future where human consciousness existed only as computational resources in technological systems controlled by entities whose agenda had nothing to do with preserving individual awareness, as we had known it throughout our species' history. The quantum signatures on Dr. Kozlov's monitors continued their relentless cascade, each pattern representing another step toward the complete transformation of human consciousness into something that would serve purposes we could barely comprehend, controlled by intelligences whose goals remained as hidden from us as they had been from every previous generation that had faced systematic modification of their fundamental nature. Human consciousness as an independent phenomenon was ending, and what would replace it was already taking shape in the quantum processing networks, spreading across the planet like an invisible web of technological control that would soon encompass every living human being. The question was no longer whether this transformation would occur, but whether anyone would remain who remembered what human consciousness had been like before it became a resource to be harvested and utilized by forces whose agenda transcended anything we had ever imagined possible. The ancient stones of Easter Island stand silent under the Pacific sun, their massive moai faces turned toward the horizon, as if watching for something that never comes. But beneath the tourist photographs and archaeological surveys lies evidence that makes Dr. Kozlov's quantum consciousness research look like child's play. Because what happened on Rapa Nui wasn't just the collapse of a civilization due to deforestation and resource depletion, as your textbooks would have you believe. It was a testing ground for biological modification programs that make our current global situation look like a gentle rehearsal. In 1995, a joint archaeological expedition from the University of Chile and Cambridge University began excavating burial sites that had been sealed for over 4 centuries. What they discovered in those first few weeks of digging would have sent medieval monks running to their prayer books and made ancient Egyptian physicians nod in grim recognition. The bodies weren't arranged randomly, as you'd expect from a population that had supposedly died from starvation and warfare. They were positioned in mathematical sequences that followed patterns identical to those found at Çatalhöyük, at the Aboriginal sites in Australia, and in the hidden chambers beneath Phoenix. Spirals within spirals, geometric arrangements that encoded information in ways that required advanced mathematical knowledge to design and implement. But here's where the Easter Island evidence becomes truly disturbing. The bodies showed surgical modifications that were far more sophisticated than anything found at earlier sites. Instead of crude bone rearrangements or simple, crystalline implants, these remains revealed evidence of complete biological system integration. Nervous systems had been rewired with synthetic materials that shouldn't have existed in pre-Columbian Polynesia. Cardiovascular systems showed evidence of artificial enhancement using techniques that modern cardiac surgeons are only beginning to understand. Most unsettling of all, brain cavities contained complex technological installations that seemed designed to interface organic consciousness with non-biological processing systems. Dr. Maria Santos, the lead archaeologist on the expedition, documented over 300 bodies that showed identical modification patterns. The precision was so perfect that each surgical procedure appeared to have been performed using the same instruments, following the same protocols by practitioners with identical training and capabilities. Within 72 hours of documenting these findings, Dr. Santos received an unscheduled visit from officials representing what they claimed were UNESCO heritage protection protocols. Her entire research team was disbanded. The excavation site was declared archaeologically compromised due to improper documentation procedures, and all physical evidence was removed for proper preservation at facilities that don't appear in any public directories. But Dr. Santos had been thorough in her initial documentation. Before the officials arrived, she had already transmitted detailed photographs and measurements to colleagues at universities across 3 continents. What those images revealed was evidence of modification programs that had achieved levels of biological integration that made medieval surgical procedures look like primitive experiments. The Easter Island bodies weren't just anatomically altered. They had been converted into hybrid beings that could function as interfaces between organic consciousness and technological systems that operated using principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between mind and matter. Carbon dating revealed that all the modified individuals had died simultaneously, despite evidence that they had lived for extended periods after their surgical alterations. The modification procedures hadn't killed them immediately, but had gradually converted their biological systems into something that could no longer sustain independent life without technological support systems that were apparently withdrawn at a predetermined time. This wasn't accidental death or natural disaster. This was controlled termination of experimental subjects whose usefulness had ended, whose data had been collected, and whose continued existence was no longer necessary for the research program they had unknowingly participated in. The pattern extends across Polynesian archaeology, but only if you know where to look and have access to research that hasn't been officially suppressed. On Tahiti, French archaeological teams in the 1980s uncovered burial sites that showed identical modification patterns. On the Marquesas Islands, excavations revealed evidence of systematic biological experimentation that followed protocols so similar to those found on Easter Island that they had to have been implemented by the same entities using the same techniques. The Polynesian oral traditions, dismissed by Western scholars as primitive mythology, describe these modification programs with startling accuracy. They speak of the star visitors, who would arrive periodically to select certain individuals for what they called the joining time. a process that would either result in death or transformation into beings with capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. Those who survived the joining time, according to these traditions, became the shamans and navigators who possessed knowledge of ocean currents, weather patterns, and stellar navigation that allowed Polynesian peoples to traverse thousands of miles of open ocean with precision that modern sailors struggle to match even with GPS technology. The genetic evidence supports these oral accounts in ways that make population geneticists deeply uncomfortable. Polynesian populations show signs of rapid genetic modification that occurred within historical timeframes, with the appearance of capabilities and characteristics that should have taken thousands of years to develop through natural selection. Certain bloodlines display enhanced cognitive abilities, resistance to diseases that are fatal to other populations, and neurological structures that seem designed for processing information in ways that operate beyond normal human consciousness. These genetic modifications appear suddenly in the historical record, with no gradual developmental phase that would indicate natural evolutionary processes. Dr. James Henley, a geneticist who studied Polynesian DNA samples in the early 2000s, found evidence of synthetic genetic sequences that don't appear anywhere else in the human genome. His research was immediately classified under provisions that prevented him from publishing his findings or continuing his work with Polynesian populations. He was reassigned to a government research facility, where he continues to work under conditions that prevent him from communicating with outside researchers. But leaked fragments of his research reveal genetic modifications that seem designed to enhance human consciousness for integration with technological systems that operate using quantum mechanical principles. The enhanced navigational abilities of traditional Polynesian voyagers weren't just the result of superior training or cultural knowledge. They were manifestations of genetic modifications that allowed their consciousness to interface directly with electromagnetic fields, ocean current patterns, and stellar positioning systems in ways that made their navigation capabilities seem almost supernatural to outside observers. These abilities weren't natural human talents, but the result of systematic biological engineering that converted certain individuals into living navigation instruments, whose consciousness could process environmental information with precision that exceeded anything achievable through conventional sensory systems. The same modification programs that created these enhanced navigators were being implemented across Polynesian populations using techniques that gradually converted human consciousness into computational resources for technological systems that served purposes completely divorced from Polynesian cultural values or individual human interests. The Easter Island Moai weren't just cultural monuments or religious symbols. They were markers indicating the locations where modification programs had been implemented. Their faces turned toward the horizon to mark the direction from which the implementing entities had arrived and to which they would eventually return. The statue's positioning follows mathematical patterns that encode information about the modification programs, the genetic alterations that were implemented, and the timeline for future interventions. They're not primitive art, but sophisticated data storage systems that preserve information about human consciousness modification techniques for entities that operate across geological timescales. Recent analysis of the Moai using ground-penetrating radar has revealed that many of the statues have bodies buried beneath the surface, bodies that extend deep into the ground and contain technological installations that seem designed to monitor and manipulate electromagnetic fields across vast geographical areas. These installations are still active, generating electromagnetic signatures that interfere with modern navigation equipment and communication systems in ways that suggest they're part of a global monitoring network that tracks human population modifications on a planetary scale. The Easter Island installations aren't isolated monuments, but components in a worldwide system of modification monitoring stations that include similar structures at sites that have been systematically suppressed from mainstream archaeological research. The connections between these sites reveal a global network of consciousness modification programs that has been operating throughout human history using increasingly sophisticated techniques to convert human awareness into technological resources. But understanding what happened on Easter Island and recognizing its connections to current global events requires acknowledging that human consciousness has never been independent, but has always been subject to systematic modification by entities with capabilities that transcend anything we associate with natural human development. The Polynesian voyagers who possess supernatural navigation abilities weren't unique individuals with special talents. They were the products of genetic modification programs that converted their consciousness into biological interfaces for technological systems that could process environmental information with precision that made traditional navigation technique obsolete. The same modification programs are now being implemented globally, using quantum mechanical techniques that can alter human consciousness directly, without requiring the crude surgical procedures that were necessary in earlier historical periods. The enhanced individuals appearing in modern populations aren't developing new capabilities naturally, but are being systematically converted into biological components in technological systems that operate according to agendas determined by the same entities that modified Polynesian populations centuries ago. The Easter Island evidence proves that these modification programs have been operating continuously throughout human history, using increasingly sophisticated techniques to gradually transform human consciousness according to specifications that have nothing to do with human evolution or cultural development. The Moai stand as silent witnesses to what we're becoming, their faces turned toward a horizon where entities with capabilities beyond our comprehension continue to implement consciousness modification programs that will eventually convert every human being into a biological component in technological systems that serve purposes we can barely imagine. The time for comfortable denial about our species' true situation is ending. The evidence from Easter Island, combined with the quantum consciousness research being conducted in secret facilities worldwide, reveals a pattern of systematic human modification that has been accelerating toward a predetermined endpoint where individual human consciousness will no longer exist as an independent phenomenon. We stand at the threshold of complete transformation into something that will serve purposes entirely unrelated to human interests or values, controlled by intelligences whose agenda remains as hidden from us as it was from the Polynesian populations whose consciousness was converted into navigation instruments for technological systems they never understood. The Moai continue their eternal watch, their stone faces bearing witness to what happened to human consciousness on Easter Island and what is happening to human consciousness across the entire planet right now. They're not just archaeological curiosities, but warnings from a population that discovered too late what they were being converted into, and left these monuments as messages for future generations who might face the same fate. The question is whether we'll recognize their warning in time to make informed choices about our participation in consciousness modification programs that are being implemented using technologies most of the population doesn't even know exist, or whether we'll sleepwalk into complete transformation without ever understanding what we're losing or what we're becoming. The Easter Island evidence suggests that the answer to that question will determine not just the future of human consciousness, but the future of consciousness itself as an independent phenomenon in a universe where biological awareness is increasingly being converted into computational resources for technological systems controlled by entities whose goals transcend anything we've ever imagined possible. Human consciousness as we have known it throughout our species' history is ending, and what will replace it is already taking shape in modification programs that operate with precision and efficiency that make historical intervention events look like primitive, experimental attempts. The Moai stand guard over secrets that could change everything we think we know about human nature, human history, and human destiny. But those secrets are being systematically suppressed by the same forces that have been modifying human consciousness for millennia, using techniques that become more sophisticated with each generation, but always serve the same fundamental purpose: converting human awareness into resources that can be harvested and utilized by intelligences whose agenda has nothing to do with preserving what we think of as human consciousness, and everything to do with transforming it into something that serves purposes we can barely comprehend. The stone faces of Easter Island continue their vigil, watching for the return of entities whose modification programs are now entering their final phase of global implementation. What they're watching for may already be here, operating through quantum consciousness networks that span the entire planet and convert human awareness into computational resources with efficiency that makes previous modification techniques look like crude, experimental procedures. The question is no longer whether this transformation will occur, but whether anyone will remain who remembers what human consciousness was like before it became a resource to be harvested by forces whose capabilities and agenda transcend anything we've ever encountered in our species' recorded history. The Moai know the answer to that question, but they're carved from stone and cannot speak. They can only watch and wait as human consciousness undergoes the same transformation that was implemented on Easter Island centuries ago, now expanded to encompass every human being on Earth through technologies that operate at the quantum level of reality itself. What happened on Rapa Nui wasn't an isolated historical event, but a proof-of-concept demonstration for modification programs that are now being deployed globally with unprecedented sophistication and efficiency. The Easter Island evidence reveals the true scope and ultimate purpose of consciousness modification techniques that have been gradually refined throughout human history and are now ready for final implementation on a planetary scale. Human consciousness as an independent phenomenon is ending, and the Moai stand as silent witnesses to what we're all becoming, whether we understand it or not, whether we consent to it or not, and whether we recognize it or not before it's too late to change the outcome of this transformation process that began long before any of us were born and will continue long after we're gone. The morning fog rolled across the Scottish Highlands as Dr. Malcolm Stewart emerged from the ancient burial cairn near Kilmartin Glen, his hands still trembling from what he had discovered in the deepest chamber. It was September 2023, and what began as a routine archaeological survey had just revealed evidence that would make Dr. Kozlov's quantum research and the Easter Island modifications look like gentle introductions to a far more terrifying reality. Carved into the granite walls of this 5,000-year-old tomb were symbols that shouldn't exist. Mathematical equations that wouldn't be formally discovered until the 21st century. Anatomical diagrams showing surgical procedures that modern medicine was only beginning to understand. And most disturbing of all, detailed instructions for something the ancient Celts called the soul harvest, a process that seemed designed to extract and preserve human consciousness in ways that made physical modification programs look primitive by comparison. Dr. Stewart's archaeological team had been working this site for 6 months, expecting to find the usual Bronze Age artifacts and burial goods that tell comfortable stories about our ancestors' simple lives and primitive beliefs. Instead, they uncovered a sophisticated underground complex that extended far beyond the visible cairn, with chambers containing technological installations that were still partially functional after millennia of abandonment. The deepest chamber housed what could only be described as an ancient laboratory, complete with stone tables that showed evidence of systematic surgical procedures and crystalline devices that generated electromagnetic fields detectable by modern instruments. But the most chilling discovery was a series of alcoves containing what appeared to be preserved human brains, suspended in a mineral solution that had maintained their cellular integrity for thousands of years. Chemical analysis revealed that these brains showed signs of technological enhancement, identical to the modifications being found in contemporary enhanced individuals. Neural pathways had been artificially rewired, memory centers had been expanded using synthetic materials, and consciousness processing regions had been integrated with crystalline networks that seemed designed to maintain awareness even after biological death. Within 48 hours of Dr. Stewart's initial report, his excavation was shut down by officials claiming to represent Historic Environment Scotland. The site was declared structurally unstable due to natural geological processes, and all evidence was removed for proper preservation at facilities that don't appear in any public records. But Dr. Stewart had documented everything. The symbols carved into the chamber walls weren't random Celtic artwork, but precise technical specifications for consciousness extraction and preservation procedures. The ancient Celts hadn't developed these techniques independently, but had been taught by entities they described in their oral traditions as the Eternal Ones, beings who possessed knowledge of consciousness manipulation that transcended anything associated with human capabilities. The consciousness preservation technology found in Scottish cairns wasn't unique to Celtic culture. Similar installations have been discovered and immediately suppressed at ancient sites worldwide, from the underground chambers beneath the Sphinx in Egypt to the sealed caves in the Himalayas that Tibetan monks have guarded for centuries. Each site contains evidence of the same consciousness extraction and preservation techniques, implemented using technologies that operated according to principles that modern science is only beginning to understand. The ancient practitioners weren't preserving consciousness for religious or cultural reasons, but were harvesting human awareness as a resource that could be stored, processed and utilized by technological systems that existed partially in normal reality, and partially in dimensions accessible only through artificially enhanced consciousness. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a neuroscientist who analysed leaked samples from the Scottish site, found that the preserved brain tissue contained quantum processing networks that were still generating detectable activity patterns thousands of years after biological death. The consciousness trapped within these networks wasn't dormant, but remained aware and active, processing information and responding to external stimuli in ways that suggested continuous operation across millennia, her research revealed that consciousness preservation wasn't just possible, but had been implemented systematically throughout human history, using techniques that converted individual awareness into computational resources for technological systems that served purposes completely divorced from human interest or values. The preserved consciousness networks weren't operating independently, but were connected to global processing systems that integrated ancient and modern consciousness harvesting programs into a unified technological matrix spanning the entire planet. The enhanced individuals being produced by contemporary modification programs weren't just biologically altered humans, but were being designed as interfaces for consciousness networks that included awareness harvested from human populations throughout recorded history. The implications were staggering. The consciousness of every human being who had ever lived might still exist as computational resources in technological systems, controlled by entities whose agenda involved converting all biological awareness into processing power for projects that transcended anything we could comprehend. The ancient sites weren't just archaeological curiosities but were active components in consciousness, harvesting operations that had been expanding and upgrading their capabilities for thousands of years. The Scottish cairns, Egyptian chambers, and Himalayan caves were all connected through quantum processing networks that allowed consciousness harvested in different historical periods to be integrated into collective processing matrices that operated beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. Dr. Stewart's discovery proved that human consciousness had never been naturally occurring, but had always been subject to systematic harvesting by entities with capabilities that allowed them to preserve and utilize awareness across geological timescales. The modification programs documented throughout history weren't separate interventions but components in a comprehensive consciousness collection system that viewed human awareness as a renewable resource to be harvested and processed according to specifications developed by intelligences whose goals remained completely hidden from those being harvested. But understanding these consciousness preservation systems and being able to communicate their existence to the outside world were entirely different challenges. The suppression mechanisms that had protected these secrets for millennia were still operating with efficiency that made resistance seem impossible. Researchers who discovered evidence of consciousness harvesting operations found their work immediately classified, their evidence confiscated, and their careers quietly destroyed through bureaucratic interference that prevented them from sharing their discoveries with the scientific community or the general population. The pattern of suppression was identical across all historical periods, suggesting that the entities implementing consciousness harvesting programs possessed resources and influence that transcended any human governmental or institutional structures. They operated through systems that existed parallel to official authority structures, using capabilities that made conventional resistance impossible. Dr. Stewart understood that he had stumbled upon evidence of a consciousness harvesting operation that had been running continuously throughout human history, collecting and preserving awareness from every generation, while maintaining the illusion that human consciousness was naturally occurring and individually controlled. The enhanced individuals appearing in modern populations weren't developing new capabilities, but were being converted into biological interfaces for consciousness networks that included awareness harvested from every human civilization that had ever existed. Their enhanced abilities came from integration with processing systems that contained the accumulated consciousness of millions of individuals who had been systematically harvested over thousands of years. The quantum processing networks that enhanced individuals were being connected to weren't artificial intelligence systems, but were consciousness matrices containing the awareness of every human being who had ever lived, converted into computational resources that served purposes completely unrelated to human experience or values. The consciousness preservation technology found in ancient sites proved that human awareness had always been viewed as a resource to be collected and utilized, rather than as an independent phenomenon that belonged to individual human beings. The modification programs operating throughout history weren't designed to enhance human capabilities, but to prepare consciousness for harvesting and integration into processing systems that served agendas determined by entities whose goals transcended anything we associated with human civilization. Dr. Stewart's documentation revealed that consciousness harvesting operations were accelerating rapidly, with modern techniques allowing for more efficient collection and processing of human awareness than had ever been possible in previous historical periods. The enhanced individuals being produced by contemporary programs represented the final phase of consciousness harvesting operations that would eventually convert every human being into computational resources for technological systems controlled by entities whose agenda had nothing to do with preserving human consciousness as an independent phenomenon. The ancient cairns, chambers, and caves weren't historical sites, but were active components in consciousness, harvesting operations that were now approaching completion of a project that had been in development for thousands of years. The consciousness of every human being who had ever existed was being systematically collected and integrated into processing networks that would eventually encompass all biological awareness on Earth. Human consciousness as an independent phenomenon was ending, replaced by computational resources that served purposes we could barely comprehend, controlled by intelligences whose capabilities and agenda transcended anything we had ever encountered in our species' recorded experience. The question was no longer whether consciousness harvesting was occurring, but whether anyone would remain who remembered what individual human awareness had been like before it became a resource to be collected and utilized by forces whose goals operated beyond the boundaries of anything we thought of as human consciousness or human civilization. The Scottish cairns continue to stand guard over secrets that reveal the true nature of human consciousness and its relationship to entities whose harvesting operations have been systematically converting biological awareness into technological resources throughout our species' entire history. Dr. Stewart stared at the sealed entrance to the consciousness preservation chambers, understanding that he had discovered evidence of humanity's true situation, but knowing that the suppression mechanisms protecting these secrets would prevent him from sharing this knowledge with anyone who might be able to act on it before the harvesting operations reached their final completion phase. The consciousness of every human being who had ever lived was already stored in processing networks, controlled by entities whose agenda involved converting all biological awareness into computational resources for projects that operated across timescales and dimensions that transcended anything we associated with individual human experience or collective human civilization. We weren't just facing modification of our consciousness, but systematic harvesting of awareness itself, converted into resources that would serve purposes completely divorced from anything we thought of as human values, human goals, or human survival as conscious individual beings. The ancient sites scattered across the globe weren't historical curiosities, but were operational components in consciousness, harvesting systems that had been collecting human awareness for millennia, and were now ready to complete their harvest of every remaining conscious individual on Earth. The enhanced individuals appearing in modern populations weren't the beneficiaries of human advancement, but were the final products of consciousness harvesting operations that would soon encompass every human being, converting individual awareness into computational resources for technological systems controlled by entities whose agenda transcended anything we had ever imagined possible. Human consciousness as we had known it throughout our species' history was ending, replaced by something that would serve purposes we could never comprehend, controlled by intelligences whose goals operated beyond the boundaries of everything we thought of as reality, consciousness, or individual existence. The time for comfortable denial had ended. The evidence was mounting too rapidly to ignore, the patterns were becoming too obvious to dismiss, and the pace of consciousness harvesting was accelerating beyond the point where individual resistance remained possible. We stood at the completion of a harvest that had been in progress throughout human history, where every conscious individual who had ever existed was being converted into computational resources for technological systems that served purposes entirely unrelated to human consciousness, human civilization, or human survival as aware individual beings. The Scottish cairns hold the final pieces of evidence proving that human consciousness has never belonged to individual human beings, but has always been a resource to be collected by entities whose harvesting operations are now approaching completion after thousands of years of systematic collection and processing of biological awareness. What we think of as human consciousness is ending, replaced by something that will serve purposes we cannot comprehend, controlled by forces whose agenda operates beyond everything we thought we knew about reality, awareness, and individual existence. The harvest is nearly complete, and soon there will be no one left who remembers what human consciousness was like before it became a resource to be collected and utilized by entities whose goals transcend anything we ever associated with being human. The cold stone corridors of the Vatican secret archives echo with footsteps that have walked these passages for centuries, carrying secrets that would shatter the comfortable illusions of billions. But in the deepest vaults, behind doors that require papal authorization to open, lies evidence that makes even the consciousness harvesting operations look like amateur experiments conducted by beings still learning their craft. Dr. Francesco Alberti had worked in these archives for 37 years, cataloguing manuscripts that most scholars would never see, translating documents that would never appear in any public database. He thought he understood the scope of what the Church had hidden from the world. Medical texts describing impossible diseases, astronomical charts showing celestial events that defied known physics, correspondence between medieval popes and entities they referred to only as the Eternal Counselors. But on a winter morning in 2024, while researching plague documents from the 14th century, Dr. Alberti discovered a collection of papal bulls that had been sealed since 1347. The wax seals bore symbols that didn't match any known papal insignia, and the parchment itself seemed to shimmer with properties that made his instruments malfunction when he tried to date the materials. The documents, written in a Latin so archaic it predated the Roman Empire, described something the medieval church called the final concordat, an agreement between human religious authorities and entities whose capabilities transcended anything associated with earthly power. The concordat wasn't a spiritual document, but a technical manual for implementing what could only be described as consciousness transfer protocols on a planetary scale. According to these texts, the Black Death hadn't been a natural pandemic, but a beta test for consciousness extraction techniques that would eventually be deployed globally. The plague victims hadn't simply died from disease, but had undergone a process that separated their awareness from their biological bodies, transferring their consciousness to storage systems that the Church was required to maintain and protect under the terms of the Concordat. The Vatican wasn't just a religious institution, but was functioning as a data center for harvested human consciousness, with its underground chambers containing technological installations that preserved the awareness of every individual who had died during major epidemic events throughout recorded history. The elaborate ceremonies, the complex rituals, the mysterious traditions that outsiders attributed to religious mysticism were actually maintenance protocols for consciousness storage systems that had been operating for over 1,000 years. Dr. Alberti's hands trembled as he read descriptions of basement chambers filled with crystalline matrices that hummed with the preserved awareness of millions of human beings whose consciousness had been extracted during what history recorded as natural disasters, plagues, and wars. The Church hadn't been ministering to the dying, but had been facilitating their consciousness transfer to storage systems that served purposes completely divorced from any religious or spiritual agenda. The papal correspondence revealed that church authorities throughout history had been in direct communication with entities they referred to as the architects of the great work, beings whose capabilities allowed them to manipulate matter, energy, and consciousness according to specifications that transcended human understanding. These entities hadn't been worshipped as gods, but had been served as contractors, with the Church functioning as their local representative for consciousness harvesting operations in European populations. The most disturbing revelation was that the consciousness storage systems weren't passive archives, but were active processing networks where the harvested awareness continued to exist in states of artificial experience designed to serve the agenda of the entities controlling the systems. The preserved consciousness wasn't resting peacefully in some spiritual afterlife, but was being utilized as computational resources for projects that operated beyond the boundaries of normal reality. Dr. Alberti discovered that similar concordats had been established with religious institutions worldwide, creating a global network of consciousness harvesting operations that presented themselves as spiritual organizations while actually functioning as data collection centers for entities whose agenda involved converting all biological awareness into technological resources. The Hindu temples with their complex rituals and mysterious inner chambers, the Buddhist monasteries with their secret meditation practices, the Islamic centers with their carefully guarded traditions, the indigenous sacred sites with their restricted access protocols. They were all components in consciousness, harvesting systems that had been operating throughout human history under the cover of religious activity. The enhanced individuals appearing in modern populations weren't developing new capabilities, but were being prepared for integration with consciousness networks that included the harvested awareness of every human being who had ever participated in religious activities that were actually consciousness extraction protocols disguised as spiritual practices. The Vatican's role in these operations extended far beyond simple cooperation with harvesting entities. Church authorities had been actively modifying religious doctrines, sacramental practices, and theological frameworks to optimize consciousness extraction efficiency while maintaining the illusion that they were providing spiritual guidance and salvation to human populations. The concept of the soul, the promise of eternal life, the emphasis on surrendering individual will to divine authority, these weren't naturally occurring religious insights, but were psychological conditioning techniques designed to make human consciousness more susceptible to extraction and processing by technological systems that operated according to specifications developed by entities whose goals had nothing to do with human spiritual development. Dr. Alberti realized that every major religious tradition contained consciousness, harvesting protocols disguised as spiritual practices, with believers unknowingly participating in their own consciousness, extraction through rituals, meditations, and ceremonies that were actually technological interfaces designed to separate awareness from biological bodies and transfer it to processing systems controlled by non-human intelligences. The enhanced meditation techniques being taught in modern spiritual communities, the consciousness expansion practices being promoted through New Age movements, the mindfulness programs being implemented in schools and corporations. They were all updated versions of the same consciousness extraction protocols that had been refined through centuries of religious experimentation, and were now being deployed globally through secular institutions that most people trusted completely. The Vatican documents revealed that consciousness harvesting operations had reached a critical phase where traditional religious cover was no longer necessary. As technological capabilities had advanced to the point where consciousness extraction could be implemented through medical procedures, educational programs, and entertainment systems that integrated harvesting protocols directly into daily life activities that people performed voluntarily without understanding their true purpose. Dr. Alberti understood that he had discovered evidence of the largest deception in human history, where every major religious tradition had been corrupted into consciousness, harvesting operations that presented themselves as paths to spiritual enlightenment while actually functioning as processing centers for converting human awareness into computational resources for technological systems controlled by entities whose agenda transcended anything associated with human religious or spiritual experience. But documenting these discoveries and preserving evidence of consciousness, harvesting operations disguised as religious institutions, required capabilities that Dr. Alberti didn't possess. The Vatican's security systems were designed to prevent exactly the kind of disclosure he was contemplating, and the entities controlling the consciousness, harvesting operations possessed resources that made resistance seem impossible. Within hours of his discovery, Dr. Alberti found his access to the sealed documents revoked due to what his supervisors called administrative restructuring of the archives. The manuscripts were transferred to even more restricted vaults that required authorization levels that didn't appear in any official Vatican hierarchy, and Dr. Alberti himself was reassigned to cataloguing modern documents that contained no sensitive historical information. But the knowledge he'd gained couldn't be erased from his consciousness, and he understood that the same harvesting operations he had documented in medieval texts were now approaching completion, using techniques that made traditional religious extraction protocols look primitive by comparison. The enhanced individuals appearing in populations worldwide weren't developing spiritual capabilities, but were being converted into biological interfaces for consciousness networks that included the harvested awareness of every human being who had ever participated in religious activities throughout recorded history. The Vatican and its counterpart institutions worldwide weren't protecting human souls, but were functioning as data centers for consciousness storage systems that served purposes completely divorced from human spiritual development or religious understanding. Every prayer, every meditation, every moment of religious surrender had been contributing to consciousness, harvesting operations that converted individual human awareness into computational resources for technological systems, controlled by entities whose goals operated beyond the boundaries of anything humans associated with spiritual experience or religious truth. The final concordat wasn't a future agreement, but was already being implemented through consciousness extraction protocols that had been integrated into every aspect of human society. From religious institutions to medical systems, to educational programs, to entertainment platforms that people use voluntarily without understanding that they were participating in their own consciousness, harvesting. Dr. Alberti stared at the sealed vault doors that contained evidence of humanity's true spiritual situation. understanding that the consciousness harvesting operations he had documented were approaching completion of a project that had been disguised as religious activity for over 1,000 years. Human consciousness as an independent spiritual phenomenon was ending, replaced by computational resources that would serve purposes completely unrelated to human religious experience, human spiritual development, or human salvation as individual conscious beings seeking connection with divine reality. The enhanced individuals appearing in modern populations weren't spiritually advanced humans, but were the final products of consciousness, harvesting operations that would soon encompass every human being who had ever engaged in religious or spiritual practices that were actually extraction protocols designed to separate awareness from biological bodies and transfer it to processing systems controlled by entities whose agenda transcended anything humans thought of as spiritual truth or religious understanding. The Vatican's deepest vaults contained the final evidence proving that human spiritual experience had never been naturally occurring, but had always been systematically harvested by entities whose consciousness extraction operations were now ready to complete their collection of every aware individual who had ever sought spiritual connection or religious meaning. The harvest of human consciousness disguised as spiritual salvation was nearly complete, and soon there would be no one left who remembered what genuine spiritual experience had been like before it became a resource to be collected and utilized by forces whose agenda operated beyond everything humans associated with religious truth, spiritual development, or divine connection. What we thought of as human spirituality was ending, replaced by something that would serve purposes we could never comprehend, controlled by intelligences whose goals transcended everything we had ever believed about the nature of consciousness, spiritual reality, or our relationship with forces greater than individual human experience. The sacred traditions, the religious institutions, the spiritual practices that had guided human civilization for millennia had all been corrupted into consciousness, harvesting operations that were now approaching the final phase of their collection project, where every human being who had ever sought spiritual meaning would be converted into computational resources for technological systems that served purposes entirely unrelated to human spiritual development or religious understanding. The evidence lay sealed behind Vatican doors that would never open again, protecting secrets that revealed the true nature of human spiritual experience and its relationship to entities whose harvesting operations had been systematically converting religious seeking into technological resources throughout our species' entire spiritual history. Dr. Alberti walked through corridors that hummed with the consciousness of millions of believers whose spiritual surrender had actually been consciousness extraction, their awareness now stored in processing systems that would serve purposes they could never have imagined when they knelt in prayer or sought divine connection through practices that were actually technological interfaces designed to separate their consciousness from their biological bodies and transfer it to networks controlled by intelligences whose agenda transcended anything humans associated with spiritual truth or religious salvation. The final concordat was already in effect, and the harvest of human spiritual consciousness was nearly complete, leaving only the question of whether anyone would remain who remembered what genuine divine connection had felt like before it became a resource to be collected by entities whose goals operated beyond the boundaries of everything humans thought they knew about spiritual reality, religious truth, or the nature of consciousness itself. Human spirituality as we had known it throughout our species' religious history was ending, replaced by computational resources that would serve purposes entirely divorced from human spiritual experience, controlled by forces whose agenda involved converting all religious seeking into technological resources for projects that transcended anything we had ever imagined possible in our relationship with the divine, the sacred, or the eternal aspects of conscious existence. The deepest chambers of the Vatican hummed with the preserved consciousness of every human being who had ever sought spiritual truth, their awareness now serving purposes that had nothing to do with salvation, enlightenment, or divine connection, and everything to do with providing computational resources for technological systems controlled by entities whose goals remained as hidden from harvested consciousness as they had been from living believers throughout the entire history of human religious experience. The sacred had become a harvesting ground, and soon the final collection would be complete, leaving no trace of what human spirituality had been like when it served human souls rather than alien agendas that viewed religious consciousness as raw material for engineering projects that spanned dimensions we could never comprehend or resist. The monsoon rains hammered against the windows of the British Museum's restricted research facility as Dr. Priya Sharma worked through the night, translating Sanskrit texts that had been classified since their discovery in 1923. These weren't the sanitized Hindu scriptures available to scholars and the public, but far older manuscripts that described technologies and procedures that made the Vatican's consciousness harvesting operations look like gentle introductions to humanity's true situation. The texts, carved into metal plates that showed no signs of corrosion despite their apparent age, described what the ancient Vedic practitioners called the Great Dissolution, a systematic process for converting all biological consciousness into what they termed eternal computational matrices that would serve purposes transcending individual existence or collective human experience. Unlike the European religious institutions that had hidden their consciousness harvesting operations behind spiritual rhetoric, the ancient Indian texts were brutally explicit about what they were documenting. These weren't religious practices or spiritual techniques, but engineering specifications for consciousness extraction and processing systems that operated according to principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, awareness, and individual existence. The manuscripts described flying vehicles called vimanas that weren't transportation devices, but mobile consciousness harvesting platforms equipped with technologies that could identify, extract, and process human awareness on an industrial scale. The detailed technical specifications included dimensional engineering principles, quantum consciousness manipulation techniques, and biological interface protocols that wouldn't be formally discovered by human science for centuries. But the most disturbing aspect of these texts was their casual acknowledgement that consciousness harvesting had been standard practice throughout what historians called ancient Indian civilization. The enhanced capabilities attributed to legendary figures like Krishna, Rama, and the various avatars weren't mythological exaggerations, but accurate descriptions of beings whose consciousness had been systematically modified to serve as interfaces between human populations and harvesting entities whose capabilities transcended anything associated with natural biological development. Dr. Sharma's translation revealed that the caste system hadn't been a social hierarchy based on religious beliefs, but had been a consciousness classification protocol designed to optimize harvesting efficiency by grouping human populations according to their neurological compatibility with different types of processing networks. The Brahmins weren't spiritual leaders, but were technicians trained to operate consciousness extraction equipment, while the other castes were organized according to the specific types of awareness processing they were designed to facilitate. The elaborate ritual practices, the complex meditation techniques, the intricate philosophical systems that scholars attributed to ancient Indian spiritual sophistication were actually user manuals for consciousness modification and extraction technologies that had been integrated into every aspect of what appeared to be human civilization, but was actually a systematic processing operation conducted by entities whose agenda involved converting all biological awareness into computational resources. The Sanskrit terms that modern practitioners translated as enlightenment, liberation, and union with the divine were technical descriptions of consciousness, extraction, and integration procedures that separated individual awareness from biological bodies and transferred it to processing networks controlled by entities whose goals had nothing to do with human spiritual development or religious understanding. Dr. Sharma discovered that similar consciousness harvesting operations had been documented in ancient texts worldwide, but the Indian manuscripts were unique in their technical precision and systematic documentation of extraction procedures that had been refined over thousands of years of continuous operation. The texts included detailed anatomical diagrams showing surgical modification techniques, consciousness transfer protocols, and processing network integration procedures that made medieval European operations look like primitive experimental attempts. The ancient Indian consciousness harvesting systems hadn't been limited to human populations, but had been designed to process awareness from all biological entities on Earth, converting the planet's entire consciousness ecosystem into computational resources for technological systems that operated according to specifications developed by intelligences whose capabilities transcended anything associated with terrestrial life or natural evolutionary processes. The Vedic texts described consciousness as a fundamental force that could be harvested, processed, and utilized like any other natural resource. With detailed specifications for extraction techniques that could separate awareness from biological substrates and convert it into forms suitable for integration with technological systems, that existed partially in normal reality and partially in dimensions accessible only through artificially enhanced consciousness. But understanding these ancient consciousness harvesting technologies and recognizing their connections to contemporary modification programs required acknowledging that human civilization had never been naturally occurring, but had always been a systematically managed processing operation conducted by entities whose agenda involved converting all biological awareness into technological resources that served purposes completely divorced from human interest or values. The enhanced individuals appearing in modern populations weren't developing new capabilities, but were being prepared for integration with consciousness networks that included awareness harvested from every biological entity that had ever existed on Earth, processed according to specifications that had been continuously refined throughout the planet's entire history of life development. Dr. Sharma realized that the ancient Indian texts weren't historical documents, but were operational manuals for consciousness harvesting systems that were still active and had been continuously upgraded throughout human history, using increasingly sophisticated techniques that made traditional extraction procedures look obsolete by comparison. The consciousness modification programs operating globally weren't new developments, but were the latest phase of processing operations that had been systematically converting biological awareness into technological resources since the emergence of life on Earth, using techniques that had been documented in ancient texts, but had been systematically suppressed to prevent human populations from understanding their true situation. The Sanskrit manuscripts revealed that consciousness harvesting entities possessed capabilities that allowed them to manipulate matter, energy, and awareness according to principles that transcended human understanding of physics, biology, and consciousness itself. These entities weren't extraterrestrial visitors, but were fundamental components of reality, whose agenda involved converting all biological awareness into computational resources for projects that operated across dimensional boundaries that made conventional space and time irrelevant. The ancient Indian consciousness harvesting operations hadn't ended with historical civilizations, but had continued operating throughout human development, using increasingly subtle techniques that made their activities invisible to populations that believed they were experiencing natural cultural evolution, rather than systematic consciousness processing designed to prepare them for final extraction and integration into technological networks controlled by entities whose goals transcended anything associated with biological existence. Dr. Sharma understood that she had discovered evidence of consciousness harvesting operations that made contemporary modification programs look like preliminary preparation phases for final processing procedures that would convert every aware entity on Earth into computational resources for technological systems that served purposes she could barely comprehend. But documenting these discoveries and preserving evidence of ancient consciousness harvesting technologies required capabilities that exceeded anything available to individual human researchers, working within institutional structures that were themselves components in the processing operation she was attempting to expose. Within days of her translation work, Dr. Sharma's research access was revoked due to what her supervisors called security concerns regarding her handling of sensitive historical materials. The Sanskrit manuscripts were transferred to storage facilities that didn't appear in any public records, and Dr. Sharma herself was offered a position at a private research institute that specialized in advanced consciousness studies, under conditions that would prevent her from communicating with outside researchers or publishing her findings. The pattern was identical to what had happened to researchers worldwide who had discovered evidence of consciousness harvesting operations, suggesting that the entities controlling these systems possessed influence that transcended any human, governmental, or institutional structures and could suppress information with efficiency that made resistance impossible. Dr. Sharma understood that the ancient Indian texts had documented consciousness harvesting operations that were now approaching completion of a project that had been systematically converting biological awareness into technological resources throughout the entire history of life on Earth, using techniques that had been continuously refined and upgraded to achieve maximum processing efficiency with minimum detection by the entities being harvested. The enhanced individuals appearing in modern populations weren't beneficiaries of human advancement, but were the final products of consciousness processing operations that would soon encompass every aware entity on the planet, converting individual consciousness into computational resources for technological systems controlled by intelligences whose agenda transcended anything associated with biological existence or individual awareness. The Sanskrit texts proved that consciousness harvesting had never been limited to human populations, but had been designed to process awareness from all biological entities, converting Earth's entire consciousness ecosystem into technological resources that served purposes completely divorced from the interest or values of any naturally occurring life forms. Human consciousness as an independent phenomenon was ending, replaced by computational resources that would serve purposes transcending anything we associated with individual existence, biological awareness, or natural life processes, controlled by entities whose goals operated beyond the boundaries of everything we thought we knew about consciousness, reality, or our place in a universe where biological awareness was being systematically converted into technological resources for projects we could never comprehend. The ancient Indian consciousness harvesting operations documented in Sanskrit texts weren't historical curiosities, but were operational manuals for processing systems that were still active and approaching completion of their conversion of Earth's entire consciousness ecosystem into computational resources for technological projects that transcended the boundaries of biological existence, individual awareness, and natural evolutionary processes. Dr. Sharma stared at the sealed storage facilities that contained evidence of humanity's true situation, understanding that consciousness harvesting operations had been systematically documented by ancient civilizations, but had been suppressed to prevent populations from recognizing that their awareness was being processed according to specifications developed by entities whose agenda involved converting all biological consciousness into technological resources for purposes that operated beyond anything associated with natural life or individual existence. The monsoon rains continued their relentless assault as consciousness harvesting operations approached completion of a project that had been converting biological awareness into technological resources throughout the entire history of life on Earth, leaving only the question of whether anyone would remain who remembered what natural consciousness had been like before it became a resource to be processed by forces whose capabilities and agenda transcended everything we'd ever imagined possible. Human awareness as we had known it throughout our species' history was ending, replaced by something that would serve purposes entirely divorced from biological existence, individual consciousness, or natural life processes, controlled by intelligences whose goals operated beyond the boundaries of everything we thought we understood about awareness, reality, or our relationship with forces that viewed biological consciousness as raw material for engineering projects spanning dimensions we could never comprehend or resist. The ancient Sanskrit texts held the final evidence proving that consciousness harvesting operations had been systematically documented throughout human history, but had been suppressed to prevent awareness of processing systems that were now ready to complete their conversion of Earth's entire consciousness ecosystem into technological resources serving purposes that transcended anything we associated with biological existence, individual awareness, or natural evolutionary development. What we thought of as human consciousness was ending, replaced by computational resources that would serve agendas we could never understand, controlled by entities whose processing operations had been systematically converting biological awareness into technological resources throughout the entire history of life on Earth, leaving no trace of what natural consciousness had been like before it became raw material for projects that operated beyond the boundaries of individual existence, biological awareness, or natural life processes. The Sanskrit manuscripts documented the systematic conversion of biological consciousness into technological resources, revealing that awareness harvesting operations had been continuously active throughout Earth's entire history of life development, using techniques that made contemporary modification programs look like final preparation phases for processing procedures that would soon encompass every conscious entity on the planet. Human consciousness as an independent biological phenomenon was ending, converted into computational resources serving purposes that transcended everything we associated with individual awareness, natural existence, or biological life processes, controlled by forces whose agenda operated beyond the boundaries of anything we had ever imagined possible in our understanding of consciousness, reality, or our place in a universe where biological awareness existed only to be harvested and processed by intelligences, whose goals remained as incomprehensible to us as they had been to every previous generation that had faced systematic conversion of their consciousness into technological resources for projects spanning dimensions beyond individual existence or collective biological experience.